Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is Grant, Daryl, and Cynthia, and this is the Raika Show, where we talk about technology. Sometimes things get a little wild and wacky. We'll see. Today's topic could be kind of boring or it could be kind of fun. We don't know. It will really all depend on where our little brains take us. So as we have been working through client projects and learning different new technologies to implement the right kinds of technologies for the right kinds of projects at the right times, we have found that there is an epidemic happening, and it is scary and on the order of zombies eating your brain. And it is a lack of documentation.
All right, Halloween's in the air.
All right, I told you it might be kind of boring, but we really do think that this is a discussion worth having, because for some unknown reason, people have, like, documentation's gone the way of the dodo. And why is that? Is that because programming has gotten so intuitive that you just know exactly how you would use XYZ random framework, library, plugin, whatever, and they won't need documentation? It's so obvious.
That's what they think.
But that's not true, right?
No.
Yeah. So we're talking today about what is documentation, in case you've forgotten. When do you need it, in case you've forgotten? How does it work? And
in case you've forgotten.
In case you've forgotten, and why it's so important. Because obviously you've forgotten. So, all right, so take it away.
Well, to me, the inverse of why you should, or not the inverse, the reason why you should is what I feel like we experienced at MX Logic. I mean, they had a dedicated tech writer, and she was really good, and they... to my recollection, they had really good documentation. I mean, really good documentation.
Yeah.
And they sold for a nice multiple in the middle of a giant recession. So yeah, I'm not saying that was only because they had great documentation. There were other reasons. For
entrepreneurs out there, documentation means bigger money.
Right.
Maybe that's WeWork's problem. They don't have enough documentation on their tech.
Yeah.
So when we say documentation, what are we talking about?
Well, that's what I was going to say is, we got all kinds of layers there, and MX Logic, you're right, was good at many layers of that. You've got stuff that what we'd call user documentation. And I don't even think that's part of this conversation so much, because that's what the world faces. But in the implementation of something, there's even several layers. There's API documentation, which normally we think of as just being the HTTP RESTful type calls, but API doc would also, in my mind, would include SDKs, libraries, and things like that. Here's, if you use this module, then you've got this object that's this class, and here's the methods and the properties. And so there's documentation that's out there that's not complete or not thorough, but there's also a lot of stuff out there that's just incomplete documentation, where they'll show you an example of using one of the main functions, and they'll show a couple of options in their example as part of the options that you need to set, but you can't find out what all the options are without delving into the source code and finding out what they do. And that happens all over the place.
Yeah.
And to me, you completely did not do the job.
Yeah.
Because if I sold you a car, but there were a bunch of buttons in there and you had no idea what they did, unless you took them to a mechanic and got underneath and to figure, that's like incomplete. I mean, that's really not doing the job. And that happens a lot. And then there's a ton of, we'll sort of describe to you what this does, but we won't give you, there used to be real documentation where, like I was describing, of everything that you can access, here it is, and here's what it may or may not be set to. There were syntaxes, right? What the heck is that? BNF.
Yeah.
And forms of BNF. If you go look up database documentation on Oracle or Postgres or something, you will see syntax diagrams that describe to you everything you can put in every open slot and what the options are and what they mean.
Yeah.
But you can't find that for SDKs. You can't find that for HTTP APIs.
Yeah. why has the software world just gotten really lazy? Like why?
Yes.
I mean, because I remember in the early days that when I was programming, everything was extremely well documented. Is this a function of software developers are lazy, or is this a function of how fast technology is moving that nothing is really stable for long enough to write a document about it?
I think it's a little bit of both, and a big part of it is open source.
Mm.
You know, I'm going to be the guy here that goes out on a limb and blames open source, even though I'm a big proponent of it. I've heard time and time again in open source, we don't, this is open source. If you want documentation, go write it. And I always push back hard and say, you know this product better than anybody else because you wrote it. You have to at least start the documentation.
Right.
And the proof in the pudding to me is PHP.
Yeah.
PHP always had fantastic documentation almost from the beginning. And I feel like that was one of the reasons for its success, because you could just go to php.net 20 years ago and look at the documentation. It would tell you, like Grant said about Postgres or Oracle, exactly what you needed to put where. They had some comments on the bottom, some of them not very good, but some of them really, really helpful.
Yeah.
And so I think, in answer to your question, in the last 20 years, 25 years, we've had this massive growth of open source software, because prior to that, most of the software was proprietary, and the proprietary companies could afford a dedicated tech writer. Right. That's another piece of it, right? Is dedicated tech writers are expensive. Open source doesn't have the funds to put into that. So, and they sit around waiting on someone to volunteer their time to write the documentation. And
part of that part about the speed of change to me is not maybe what we normally think of in there. It's that if I've written an API or I've put out a package, a node package or something, and here's what it does. Well, as soon as I document it, I have sort of doubled my maintenance responsibility. And a lot of time in open source, I think, and homegrown software, you're changing the software itself so fast that you're like, crap. It's sort of like tests. Okay, I can change code if I'm doing all unit test type environment. Then now I have that to maintain as well. And as soon as I say I'm going to document this, as soon as I start that, well, now I've added another burden. And in my mind, at least subconsciously, it means that all maintenance to that code is going to be that much more work. And
which comes back to maybe lazy isn't the right word, but it's not easy, right? I mean, it's not easy to document something and do it well.
I think we all need, most organizations, most teams need to realize that, investing a little bit of time up front, PHP, we had Doxygen and we had PHP Documenter and every language, almost every language has tools. And, we're talking about those different layers of documentation. There's user doc for an application way out at this level. There's user doc for an API. I'm a user when I call somebody's API to do stuff.
Right.
And so that's where we get into every time the API changes, I have to change the documentation. Then there's documentation inside code. That's where it's really missing.
Got it.
Now, when you download people's stuff and you're trying to use it or you're trying to learn from it, and there's nothing in there, that to me is laziness / arrogance.
Right.
It's almost like I like it being a mystery.
Oh.
Except that what they never recognize is they're also making it a mystery to themselves. What I always say is, if you write this, now put yourself in your shoes 6 months from now and reading that. Are you going to be able to read what you just wrote?
Yeah.
If
are you
not,
going to remember
then you
those
either
little
need
nuances?
To refactor it or document it.
Yeah.
Or both, ideally.
Interesting. So does it require a tech writer or some third party in order to make this happen correctly? Are developers, the people who are doing the core of the work and writing the code, are they capable, and should they be the ones on the hook for documenting it appropriately?
At first, I think so. At first, I think, especially open source, they have no choice.
Yeah.
They have no one else. They have no choice. But also, there's some benefit that I don't think they recognize, which is when I'm documenting something, almost always that helps me identify. It's almost another test. It helps me identify a bug.
That's another thing that kind of is a barrier to somebody documenting his own stuff, because as soon as I put right here what this thing returns under every possible condition,
if it doesn't,
it's a bug. Whereas if I don't put it on paper and it's an edge case, it's an edge case.
Yeah, exactly.
You did something a little unusual there, but that's a contract. That's a commitment. And that's the way it always works for me too. And one thing that sometimes kind of like makes me pause a little bit before documenting API stuff is like, okay, now that I'm showing example payloads and responses to this call, I better try out some of those edge cases and see what happens. Oh, and then I encounter some things where I really need to go change this. I need to go change the code. So documenting it actually drives coding. I mean, in a way, test-driven development was a big thing. Write the test, then write the code to beat the test. Almost documentation-driven development would have been another idea.
Like write the document, then write the test, then write the code. Imagine how clear it might be in your mind if you did that.
Yeah.
You know, by the time you get to actually writing the code, you really understand.
You don't have to make decisions anymore.
Right.
That's the hard part about programming, is it's just an endless stream of decisions that you're making as you're implementing stuff of, how should I do this? What's the best way to do this in light of so many factors that you're trying to keep in mind?
Yeah.
And so when you force yourself to put it down in black and white on how this thing is going to work, your mind is going to start throwing in the what ifs. What happens if they don't have a record already when this comes in? What happens if, and so that forces you to flesh all that out before you are actually editing a source file. And you've got notes in your documentation that say, if this record doesn't exist, or if, this user got deleted, or here's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And you're telling yourself a story, and then you can just go make it happen.
Yeah.
I like that.
Interesting.
Yeah. We should try that. So we have to pause so we can go change what we
do. We got to go redo a 25 years worth of code. Cause let me just, full transparency, I don't write open source software. So I don't fall into this group of people who really need to be doing this, but I think probably the amount of documentation I've really written that we're talking about, very, very little.
Yeah, we're all guilty of it.
Yeah, everybody's guilty. So we're not pointing fingers at anyone. If you're sitting in your car or at your desk or whatever, and you're thinking, oh my God, they're like calling me out. We're calling ourselves out too.
Yeah.
So let's talk for a minute. Let's talk about what does good documentation look like? So we've talked about PHP, where they have php.net, and it's very, very simple to figure out what you're trying to do in PHP, because there's almost always a method, and it's really easy to find. The documentation is really, really good.
Yeah.
Stripe is another example.
Yeah.
I would say implementing their API, we went from 0 payment structure in a client project to full subscription, one-time payment, like full payment abilities on multiple levels in less than 3 days.
Yeah.
That is amazing. And it's because their documentation is amazing.
And that's a daunting, taking someone's money, their credit card, that
is a huge, there's so much risk, and there's so much, like, if we get it wrong, it can go so badly. And because you're talking about money. Money. So let's contrast that with another payment provider that has a crap ton of documentation and all of it sucks.
Yeah.
Which is PayPal.
Yeah.
We spent the same amount of time trying to implement, well, we are going to do some finger pointing. We spent the same amount of time trying to implement anything, to get anything working in PayPal for the same client. And it took, where Stripe took a couple days, we were 6 weeks into the PayPal stuff, and it still didn't work correctly. We still ended up, they had to buy a support contract with PayPal to figure out what the heck was going on.
Oh, that's right.
And so they both have a lot of documentation. PayPal documents everything in their API. It's all out there. You can't freaking understand what the hell they're saying.
Yeah.
So quality is way more important than quantity, but it's probably both, right?
Yeah.
What are some other examples of either places where you've seen it done really well, or places you've seen it not done well?
Well, one thing I hate is the documentation that makes you feel like you chased a circle to land on the page you started on.
Yes.
Where
oh my gosh, you're
it's that,
so right.
It's that very formalized documentation, like out of Java doc, JDoc.
Yep.
And you get all these. I do like that I can find methods and properties of things and get a fixed definition of them. But then it seems like every link that is going to give you more information just takes you
end
to
up
another
back at that page you were just on.
and you can't find what you're really looking for to describe what does this thing do?
Yeah.
And I'm just chasing these, single word links, method name to this object, to that method, to that. I would, when you say quality over quantity, it's like I was thinking that even informal, that's impossible. Informal documentation that's very descriptively thorough, not flowery,
right?
But it manages to hit a bunch of different variations or variables in your mind of when I'm using this. How is this working? What's controlling how this works? And they really describe to you. And sometimes if they can relate it to the real world a little bit, some of those things. I kind of touched on generating documentation, and that made me think of something else. But it's that's good for like APIs,
right?
When you document within the source code in a particular format, these documentation generators can generate some really nice stuff, but it does tend to generate that formal stuff where it's a syntax diagram.
Right.
And nobody goes in, like on Postgres, it's like, I'll tell you what every one of those slots is. And then I'll give you this nice big paragraph.
Yeah.
That explains
if it's just the formal. Java doc was always really good about the formal, but it didn't add that color commentary.
Yeah.
And sometimes an option to me looks like, oh, that's a really great, I should try that. And then I'll see the paragraph where it says performance degradation, blah, blah, blah. This should only be you, blah, blah, blah. Oh, okay. I'll kind of ignore that option now.
Yeah.
But otherwise I would just see what it does and go, hey, this is cool.
Let me use it. Well, and that's the thing about Stripe's documentation that I love is they have sort of that formal, probably somewhat auto-gen of what those each input object and what's coming out objects look like. Then they have the descriptors and they're saying, okay, for example, you would use this in this kind of scenario or this kind of scenario. And then right next to it, they have a window that has tabs for different types of languages. So they have a PHP tab and they have a Ruby tab and they have a Java tab and they have a Python tab that shows exactly how you would implement it in the various languages. And it's like, that's complete.
Yeah.
That not only tells me what it is, what are my inputs and outputs, what can I expect this thing to be useful in what context, it shows you how to use it.
Right. It's the examples.
And that brings up another, some sites, systems, whatever, have a try me button or a demo button where, jQuery does that, I think, a lot.
NativeScript has that too. They have their playground where you can
that's becoming really popular amongst a lot of languages.
Yeah.
But when it's right there and it opens, you've got a little editor window that shows their sample code and here's the little window that shows the results. You can actually go in there and change a couple things and run me.
I think the W3 Schools website does that too with all like the CSS syntax and HTML syntax and JavaScript and stuff where, it shows you what it is and then you click on it and it opens it in a new window and you make changes in the little editor and run it in the other side.
Even the Mozilla Developer Network is doing that. Even Stack Overflow.
Yeah.
They're putting, when someone posts
like
an example, the snippets, and you can execute that snippet right there.
Yeah.
But in an API or, in any system that you're documenting, if you can, more of those is better.
Yeah.
And most of the time you're dealing with, there's just pretty much nothing.
Yeah.
Go to GitHub, go into those, look at those node packages. And so many are how to install npm install -g, this my package. Well, okay.
How do I use
globally. Now, how do I use it now? And
there's nothing.
They show
Crickets.
one example or two examples, and it's a library of all kinds of stuff. And
and you have no idea what's in there.
Right.
We see that a lot with the NativeScript plugins.
Yeah.
A lot of it's like whether they don't really understand themselves exactly what might be possible, and so they're like, we really only designed it for this one thing. But then you look at the size of the package that you're installing and you're like, this is enormous for one thing, for just being push notifications.
Formal syntax docs for those, because, you know, if I'm looking at the rad list view, just show me what all the attributes are that are valid there. There's no list like that. There's no list that for particular that I can see in their documentation, where if you're looking at a particular tag, show me what all the attributes are, what they do, what methods, you know, how do I connect?
Yeah,
you have to kind of suss it out from numerous pages.
And again, the native script documentation is one of those where it almost looks like it's organized sort of the way that Java used to, like with all the, you know, methods and properties and events. But when you click on it, it's like there's nothing else there.
Yeah.
And they almost require you in some cases to look at the hierarchy of an object to understand really what's available in the one that you're looking at based on where it came from. And it's like, if I'm looking at this, I shouldn't have to go back through 6 levels of hierarchy and look at all of the parents and grandparents, et cetera, to figure out what the hell I have available to me here.
And that made me think of something. So NativeScript is a Telerik. The company is Telerik. They're based in Eastern Europe somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where.
Yeah.
I imagine that factors into this. There's a lot of, especially open source projects out there that are developed by people in Europe, people in other non-American, non-English speaking. And I imagine there's a certain, there's a certain attribute of that where they're hesitant to write the documentation because they're like, I'm not a native English speaker. I don't want to make a fool of myself. To which I would reply, I don't care. I would rather read your broken English and you describing this product, because then it also encourages the community to come together and go, okay, well, hey, let's unbreak that English, and also let's do a French version, and let's do a Japanese version, whatever.
Exactly.
But just starting that is so important. And I think way too many of these open source projects won't even start.
Yeah. Huh. All right. Well, this was more interesting than I thought it was going to be.
I find it ironic that the big thing these days is testing. Everybody is, we got to have 100% code coverage. Nobody talks about documentation. And I would argue that it's every bit as important, if we haven't determined, maybe even more important.
So are we saying
just
that
someone passed a test doesn't tell me how I can use it?
Okay, so good tests, good code coverage, and with unit testing and integration testing still is not sufficient to tell you how you would use something or how its implementation works.
No, not at all.
Because I wonder if people went to this idea of 100% code coverage because they were thinking that it might solve some of the documentation problem too.
Could be. I think we've proven that wrong.
Yeah, because I know we've used some open source packages and various things that have good test coverage. You can see all the tests in there. Still doesn't help you understand how the hell you would use it.
Yeah.
So, all right, cool. Any last words of wisdom for our community about documentation?
Get to writing.
Just do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Even if you think you don't need to, or you think it's not important, or you think you're not the guy, be the guy.
I'll say one last thing about that, though. I found that when in certain places, depending on the work I was doing, how do I put this? There was pride in it. It was sort of it was like accepting the trophy for winning the race. I did all the work. I'm happy with the work. And now documenting it is sort of like putting a recipe that you invented, putting it down on paper to give to somebody. You're proud of what you created. Yeah. You're proud of what you did.
And you want other people to be able to use it and use it well and it make their lives easier.
You want to give out a representation of that, a physical representation, a visual representation other people can look at and see what you did.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they don't know.
That adds a level of professionalism and polish to your product.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah.
To me, when I come into a project and they have really good documentation,
it makes you want to use it more.
It makes me want to use it more. It improves my impression of the developers, of the project in general.
Yeah. You feel easier about the whole situation, a little less anxious, a little less tense, because you're like, wow, it looks like they thought some things through.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how many times have we gone in and we've seen these packages, there's no documentation, this npm install blah, and then you're done. And we've been like, I don't have time to go figure this out. I'm done.
Yeah.
And we walk away.
And you uninstall.
That could have been the perfect package for us. It would have solved all of our problems.
Right. That's what she said.
That's what she said. But, we walked away.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
I mean, let your light shine, right?
Yeah. This little light of mine.
Don't hide your light under a bushel.
Yeah. All right, good. So if you're out there, you're making software, you're intending other people to use it. If you're building software only for yourself, you can do whatever the hell you want. But if you're intending even one other person to use it, certainly if you're putting it out there for people to use in an open source way, or even more to you, if you're wanting people to buy something and use it from you, document it. Document. This is not optional. This is required. Learn a little English.
GitHub and Bitbucket both have that wiki tab for a reason.
It's exactly right. So, all right, you guys, thanks so much for joining us. This has been Grant Parks, Daryl Brogdon, and Cynthia Delaria on The Raika Show. We'll talk to you guys next time.